Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Selling with Better Stories. I am super excited to be joined by a rock star set of experts here in our space. We'll give it a couple minutes for folks to trickle in here. But I'll go ahead and cover the agenda real quick so everyone kind of gets an idea of the format today. We'll cover some admin here things in the beginning, and then we'll dive into conversations with these rock stars. We'll then go into audience Q&A. So folks out there, don't forget to go ahead and click on the Q&A button you should see here below, probably, or to the side or above, a function that's titled Q&A. Go ahead and submit those, and we'll get to those questions at that section, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up with some summary and announcements. Also, keep an eye on polls. We always love to kind of understand how we're doing and the composition of the folks that are joining us here today. Definitely want to give a shout out to everyone in the community. The PSC community is probably, in my experience, a community that really focuses on valuing their community members. So you definitely couldn't do this without you all. So thank you so much for your support. And if you're not in the Slack community, you should definitely jump in there and get going. All right, just so a little bit about how to make the most of today's webinar for everyone. As I mentioned earlier, definitely think about some questions. It can be in the beginning, it could be in the middle or towards the end there. As I alluded to earlier, we're going to be diving into those Q&A question submissions a little later. So definitely think about it. Think about how we can really utilize this time to up-level or answer any questions that you might have from these experts. So again, there's a Q&A function in the interface of Zoom. Go ahead and do that. Also, be active in chat. This is a great opportunity for folks to really meet people, network, have discussions in real time. So definitely use chat. It's a great opportunity again to really network. And one of the things I like to do is put my LinkedIn, and I always get some nice LinkedIn messages. So you can go into your LinkedIn, grab your URL, and post it in there. So just some things that I love to do. Awesome. So before we go into some introductions here, a little bit about who I am. My name is George Soto. I head up community at Reprise, and super excited today because, as we all know, there are a ton of distractions, and really being able to connect with our prospects, not just building rapport, but building a case for why they should be speaking to you and giving attention, right? And so one of the best ways to be able to do that is telling stories. And so today we're going to dive into how do we tell, as pre-sales professionals, better stories that are understood and that really nail the intention of the meeting. And so I'm super excited about diving in today. Why don't we go ahead and kick it off with some introductions. Pam, if you want to give us a quick overview, tell us a little bit about who you are, your current role, where are you based, what is your purview, and how long have you been in pre-sales?
Ooh, awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, George. So I'm Pam Dunn. I am a leader of pre-sales at Contentful, and Contentful is a content management solution, and I am based in the Boston, Massachusetts area. I've been in pre-sales now for close to 20 years, I think. It's been an amazing and long journey, but excited today to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, storytelling. So excited to be talking with yourself and the rest of the panel.
Awesome. Well, we have quite a few folks in Boston, Reprise that is, so have an affinity for that area. Erin, how are you?
Good morning, George. Hi, everyone. So excited to be here this morning. My name is Erin Baker. I am based out of Toronto, and I work at a company called Elia Care. So we provide home care software to agencies across North America. And I am a team lead on the solution engineering side at the company and have been in this role for 4 years now. So not quite as long as Pam, but very excited to be here and talk about storytelling as well.
Thank you so much for your time. And Sarah.
Sarah, you're muted.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm Sarah Jones. I work at Zendesk. I am the Global Vice President of PreSales there. I've been in PreSales for over 20 years, so all of my career. I love it, think it's the best job in the whole world in the tech industry. I am based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I am also very excited to be talking about storytelling with this fantastic panel today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. One theme here is that all of you have been in pre-sales for quite a long time and probably have seen it evolve quite a bit. I mean, I think over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm so glad to see the pre-sales role really evolve and now you're having tools being built for this role and hopefully getting the respect that it deserves, because it is the secret weapon. So, all right, awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get into our panel discussion. Pam, when should someone inject a story into a demo? And the second part of that is like, is the demo one long story, or are you sharing multiple stories or micro stories throughout the conversation?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. I mean, if we really think about it, your demo or that interaction with your prospect is really like telling a story. It's got to follow a certain narrative to be able to engage the audience. So I do believe it's really like one overarching story. But then if you think about even how a theme pops up in a movie, right? I feel like there are places along the way where you can inject other stories. So specifically, if you're thinking about, there's some specific challenge that your prospect's trying to solve, and you've got a really great story, another customer doing the same thing. So again, I feel like it really depends along the way, but I believe it all is really a little bit back to storytelling.
Awesome. Sarah, how about yourself?
Oh, I agree with everything that Pam was talking about. I think that everyone loves going to the movies, right? And they're the greatest storytellers of all. And there's always an arc, and there's always a beginning and an end. And I think that if you approach your presentation, your customer interaction in the same way, then you can interweave stories along that arc. It doesn't have to be one great story. It can be lots of stories that reiterate, especially if you're using customer examples. So stories of your customers that are helping their customers, and weave that in along that arc. It's very powerful.
Awesome. Oh, thank you for that. Erin, if I'm newer to the company, how can I gather or create stories? I know this can be quite challenging at times.
Yeah, that's a great question, because definitely being new to a company, if there's nothing formal in place, it can be very challenging to understand exactly who you should be reaching out to or where you can find those resources. I'm fortunate enough to have been at the company for 5 years now. So just over time, you start to build up all of that content that can be incorporated into your customer calls. But I think I would, first of all, recommend going to client services. So actually my first year at AlayaCare, I spent on that team and had the opportunity to implement customers on the software. Going to that team, they have so many great stories of successful implementations or where clients realized value on the software. I'd also say go to the marketing department, review case studies that have been published. You'll get really great tidbits on the ROI for various customers. One thing that I personally do is look at things like the company's mission, vision, or purpose, and then try and align yourself with those and bring in some of your own personal stories. That's a great way to become a bit more relatable with your customer as well. And then lastly, we use a tool called Gong. I don't know, Pam and Sarah, if you use it or have a similar tool, but I find that a great way to go in and look at, those top performers and see, okay, what talk tracks and stories are they using that are really resonating well? And how can I either iterate on those stories or honestly even replicate them?
That's one thing, as a former salesperson, that I was going to say. And in the past, it was like we used to call it shadowing or following a set of salespeople, right? And listening to those stories and how they're landing in real time. And of course, now you can use these call recording systems like Chorus and Gong. So thank you so much for
Absolutely.
that, Aaron. Very much appreciate it. You know, Pam, in general, what are some of the elements in your experience that make a great story, particularly for selling?
Yeah, great point. I feel like all stories have a similar narrative flow, regardless of, if you're telling a 30-second snippet of a story or if you're telling a 30-minute story, right? I think it really is all around, what's the context? Typically a story has some kind of conflict, right? So just like a good movie, like Sarah was mentioning, something's going on, and this is kind of what hooks the people, right? If we think about storytelling, remember our audience, they're probably getting a lot of demos and they're probably getting a lot of features and functions thrown at them. We don't want to do that, right? We want this to be compelling and a reason to listen to us. And also storytelling, it hits upon your limbic emotional connection, right? So you want them to connect with you emotionally. So once you've got that conflict, every good story's got to have a resolution. So we have to remember, if we're telling this story and there's a dun 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 conflict moment, we want to make sure that there's a resolution, and we're telling the story because it solves a business challenge that they're having as well. And then at the end of this has got to be some kind of transformation, right? So where we started should be completely the opposite of where we end, because that's what essentially ties up an entire story. So I think when we're thinking about that, again, sometimes if it's a quick snippet of a story, we don't usually think it through, but that's exactly what we're doing, right? Because we want to get to the end game, which is what's the solution doing for them. So I believe that all stories can pretty much be broken down into those four things.
One thing that comes to mind is this transition to most of these meetings nowadays being on Zoom. So like, how do you know that those elements that you just introduced are landing in the way that you intended, especially when you're not in the room, right? So just some things that I think about as well. Any sort of maybe tips you have for for folks around maybe managing this virtual world?
Yeah, that's a hard one, because as we all know, it's really about trying to pay attention to everything else going around you, right? When you're in a demo, there's just so many things you're trying to think about. So, this is where you can pair with your AE. And really, we think about selling, we're talking a lot about pre-sales because we're all from pre-sales, but really it's what we're trying to teach as well, is that AE and SE combination become much more collaboration, even around stories, right? So now we've got the AE, maybe they're paying a bit more attention to the cues, right? I'm actually reading a new book right now, which I'm going to throw out there. It's called Cues. Vanessa Van Eldridge, I believe is her name. It's really great, even in meetings, to be able to like pick up on cues of people. You can kind of tell when people are either totally checked out or they're listening to your story, right? Are we appealing to their limbic sense? Are we telling a story that's resonating? I like what Erin mentioned about getting those stories and kind of making them your own, right? I feel like that's also really important. You can watch Gong or Chorus calls of your colleagues to see which stories feel like they're resonating. But again, you have to make them your own. You have to believe it, just like you have to believe in your own demo, right? You have to be passionate about that story. And if you're following along with that narrative, as I mentioned, I feel like you can tell even in a Zoom or another platform virtually, whether or not those stories are actually resonating with the people that are on the call.
Aaron, what's your take on these elements?
Yeah, I completely agree with Pam. I think another framework that we often use on the SE team at Elia here is the feel, felt, found. So going in with that framework, and we understand how you're feeling as the customer. We have others who have also felt that way. But what we found, and then you go into more of the solution or value that's coming out of it as well. So I know that one is a framework that often works with our team.
Great, thank you. Sarah, what suggestions would you have for making these stories more compelling, especially if it's a longer story? How do you keep that audience engaged, kind of given some of the elements we talked about?
So I think you definitely need to be able to have the framework like everyone was talking about there. In fact, we've been piloting a formal type of framework where there's 8 steps, 8 elements to it, basically. So helping to build what that story should look like, starting with a concept. So trying to frame the interaction as an epic adventure, and then exploring with that. So you're trying to make a map for the way ahead. Identifying the characters. So this is the key people in your customer audience who you want to be able to target, so that you can be able to build that trust level between the two of them. That's really important in a story, I think. And then a function element. So the stories are way more effective than facts or opinions by themselves. So having to make the story do the work. And then having a flow. So the structure needs to be able to take us through some basic patterns, that arc that I was talking about a little while earlier. That's style. So that's making it your own, as Pam and Erin have just talked about. Organizing it. So stories work. But only if you use them well. So you need to plan about how you're telling that story. And then having a recipe with that. So we're going wide. Do you know why you need a story? Do you know where to find your story? Do you know your role in the story? Do you know what your story needs to do? Do you know how to plan it? Do you know how to then tell it? And do you know how to share it? So we've been piloting this approach for a while within Zendesk, and it's gone over pretty well. So looking to expand on that kind of actual formal template approach to stories. So yeah, we'll see how that goes in 2023.
Fantastic. Pam, what's your take on the compelling component here? How to make it more compelling?
Yeah, I everything that Sarah says resonates with me. I love, being able to tell a good story, and being able to focus on, what the problem is and the benefits, right? I feel like that's what makes the story compelling. We have to really use the whole, so what framework, right? If I'm just telling a story and it doesn't really resonate, or it really doesn't, I'm just telling it because it's the only one I learned, that's not a good story. So I feel like we have to be honest with ourselves, and I absolutely believe in demo prep and also prepping your stories. And it helps to, when you have them down on paper and you're kind of memorizing them, but also as you walk through them with your AE, I think it also helps you, to kind of check each other. Hey, do you think that this is a story that will resonate with them? Do your own so what? Is this important to them? Is this, you got to go back to making this, again, thinking about the people and the buyer's journey, right? They also want to know, how are other people using what you're presenting? Why is it important for them? So I think it really goes back to that so what, and making sure that you kind of gut checking yourself that this is really a real benefit to them.
Thank you for that. And just as a reminder to folks, go ahead and post questions. Use the Q&A function here if you do have any questions. Love the conversations and the LinkedIn sharing going on in the chat. So thank you for that. Sarah, if you were to think about what are some of the ways to craft stories when you might not have that much discovery about a particular prospect, any sort of tips or frameworks that come to mind that you could share?
Yes. So first off, discovery is absolutely key to uncovering what is most important to the customer, what their strategy and vision, their goals are, and then using the resources at your fingertips within your organization, such as those gong calls and such as the discovery information, relative customer stories, doing your research about not only the industry, but similar use cases that this particular customer is faced with, a challenge with. Then you can put all of those elements into the melting pot, and out comes a beautiful story at the end. once you've done the research, right? So you do need to be able to carve out the time up front to put all of those elements together. And sometimes that takes a lot of effort, and sometimes it's a lot easier, especially if you're dealing with customers in similar industries over and over, or you're dealing with similar use cases for your solution. But it definitely needs to be unique, definitely needs to be personalized, definitely needs to be tailored to your particular customer engagement.
Great. What tips would you have for folks out there around practicing telling these stories? I know all of us, we're essentially performing, right? And you think about the kind of what athletes and actors and so on use to practice. Any sort of frameworks or tips around that?
Well, Zoom has this great feature called the record button. So if you're doing things remotely, one of the great things that you can do is video yourself beforehand. That sounds weird, but when you see it played back to yourself, you can pick out the holes. You can see where you've maybe been too wordy, or you weren't quite clear. Or if you weren't compelling enough, if you didn't have that hook that Patton was talking about a little earlier, if you didn't have the right context, then you can tweak the script, your movie script. You can tweak that script until practice makes perfect. You can practice in front of the mirror as well, although that's not that feels a little weirder. I really like the record one, because then when it's playing back, you can really pick all the holes that you need to in how you were delivering it. Picture
Awesome.
yourself on a movie set. It makes it a lot easier when you're hitting the record button.
Let's say making it a little more fun, right?
Yes.
That's awesome. Pam, how about you? How about yourself? What tips would you provide around practicing?
Yeah, I say prep is the most important part of any presentation. So that practice is really the most important part. And that means sometimes just writing it out. And when you're working with your AE, decide, maybe you break up the story. Maybe making it compelling is that, the AE comes in at a different point in time during the story. I think it's really all about that time you practice and prep, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it right, the first time. And as Sarah mentioned, maybe it doesn't land right, or maybe you don't have the context right, but it really is all about that prep time. And you've got to prep your stories just like you prep your demo. I think that's maybe something we typically might leave to the end, but I think that's super important. And again, the more you practice them, as Sarah mentioned, and the more you take time to actually prep which ones are resonating, those are the ones that you're going to really learn and make your own. As I said, as you start telling the story, you kind of get feedback from people real time, right? And I'm also, again, a big fan of, going back and maybe picking out some of those either in Chorus or Gong or whichever tool you're using, and kind of use this as your framework as, a better way to maybe change up the story a little bit differently next time.
Erin, how much do you personalize stories to a particular audience? Let's say, pulling in elements from discovery versus having stories that are pre-built, let's say based on use cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, similar to what we've heard from Pam and Sarah, I think it's critical to bring in elements of that discovery. That is one of the most important parts prior to engaging with an SE. So that's where you understand exactly what their goals or objectives are for moving on to a new system, any challenges they may be having today. And so what I really like to do is take all of that context that's being provided through the discovery, and then take possibly a pre-built use case, but tweak it just ever so slightly so that it really is personalized to that individual prospect. So ways in which you can do that are things like using their language. So making sure that you're speaking their language and it's resonating with them, even localizing the content. So everybody always wants that customer reference of a client of a similar size in a similar area. And so being able to bring in some of those elements into the storytelling as well. Use their names in the stories, or directly, as I mentioned, embed some of those pain points and challenges that they have articulated to you through the discovery into the story, and let them see exactly where they're going to realize that value.
Pam, what's your approach?
Yeah, I love that, because I feel like we, just having the story is really not enough. Really being able to kind of, make it your own and personalize it as well. And I love what Erin said about using the names, right? I feel like it really resonates when, if I'm talking to, a VP of marketing, I find another VP of marketing, and sometimes it may not matter as much that it's someone in a different industry. But specifically, if it addresses their pain points, I think it's going to resonate. We have a tool that our amazing demo team built for us. They call it Saga, which I love the name. And it has all of our customer stories, not all of them, but a lot of the customer stories loaded in there. And it actually even lets pre-sales folks add additional ones, but we can sort by use case. We can sort by, specifics of the industry that we're trying to find. So if I'm looking for another VP of marketing, that's at a retailer in Canada, for instance, I have a really easy way to be able to search through those. So it's a nice way to be able to give pre-sales folks a leg up rather than, searching through a lot of different slide decks, et cetera, trying to find the stories. So it's been super helpful for us to be able to help to personalize it quickly and then like give you a starting point for that prep on your stories.
Awesome. Erin, do you find yourself sharing actual customer stories or creating stories to match the point that you want to make?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of fine tuning in here when you are telling the story, but going back to, I believe Pam had mentioned it, where you really do need to believe in your product and what you're saying. And the same goes for storytelling. So for me personally, I always go with actual client stories. You're more confident in telling them. There's more assurance even for you and the customer when they're making the decision in the buying process, that the story that you're telling is something that is relatable to them. And also, you never know when the prospect is going to ask any questions to you. So if you're manufacturing a story and you don't have the right responses when they start digging into some questions, I just think it's always best to try and use actual stories, and then where needed, possibly fine tuning it a little bit to personalize it to that individual.
Sarah, what's your take on this?
Oh, I agree with Erin here. It's the actual, I mean, all of us have thousands of customers, hundreds, hopefully, but many of us have thousands of customers. There is always a special nugget that you will find in your customer base that you can relate back and tell the story back. Even if you weren't personally involved, like talk to the people, the account team that's involved, the implementation, the partner who's helping that customer get live, or talk to the customer themselves. They're always willing to share when they've had a good success story. And then the more that you can build your own library, as both Erin and Pam have said, because you've got to personalize it. You have to own the stories, which means you have to internalize it and have it in your words so that you're confident relaying the details of that story that you have made your own. So yes, definitely from an actual perspective, just like Erin said, actual customer stories.
Great. Let's take a quick second to, there are a couple questions that were posted in the chat. I want to make sure we get to those. Sarah, maybe we'll stay with you here, and then Pam, I'll get your take on it. From this question's from David Goldberg. Pam, Sarah, can you net out the elements of a story you shared, please? Also, can you suggest any books or resources to help my team build and execute storytelling within demos?
Oh, I've got a great book. So Made to Stick. I think it's by Dan Pink, and maybe if I go off video, I'll get it off my bookshelf and show you the cover. Made to Stick is awesome. That also has a framework, the success framework, and it's a very quick read, and it has lots of case studies and examples woven throughout that book. So that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and I guess the piece there is, can you net out those elements of a story you shared?
So yes, you definitely need a concept, you need the exploration about it, you need some character, it needs to have a structure, it needs to have your style, and all wrapped up in basically in that recipe that you deliver.
Great. Pam, how about yourself? Any books and the sort of elements that you would net out?
Yeah, I do a lot of online for storytelling. I actually recently joined Masterclass. I don't know if anyone's ever done it. They have some great resources of learning to do storytelling in Masterclass. I know there's a subscription for that. I also rely a lot on some of the free stuff from Demo to Win, one of my favorites for like overall, lucky me, I've had the option to have Demo to Win when I think a long time ago when it probably first came out. So yeah, Bob and his team at Demo to Win do some amazing things there as well. Yeah, Made to Stick, that's a great book. And I think because obviously the internet has so many, you can go to YouTube, you can learn great storytelling from some folks out there who've been doing it for a very long time. So I would absolutely say you could find resources there as well, and teach you about, as Sarah mentioned, there's a structure around it. It feels like storytelling is natural to people who can, just bring up a story at whim. And there's lots of folks out there who are really, really good at it. But it always follows a structure. So even though it may feel less structured, if you can just get down some of the structure that Sarah was talking about. And for us, it's the 4 that I mentioned earlier about context, conflict, resolution, and transformation. And honestly, if you just start with the first and the last, I feel like the other 2 will come together, right? I have a reason why I'm actually wanting to tell you this story, and this is what happened at the end because of all those things that happened. So if you can just start working on that and really using that as part of your practice, I feel like you'll probably get much closer to where you want to be in being a better storyteller.
Erin, anything you want to add there?
I threw a link in the chat as well, but I just started a book called Stories That Stick. And that was actually a recommendation from a woman who presented as one of our keynote speakers at a conference. And I went up to her afterwards. She did a fabulous presentation, definitely had some of that framework in there, but had call to actions to the audience as well. And I asked her where she learned to craft such great stories, and that was one of her recommendations. So I'm only 50 pages in, so I still need to get through it, but so far it's been very helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have another question from John. And John, I apologize. I hope I'm not butchering your last name, but John Kazewicki. Apologize there. But John's request is to tell a meaningful story. We need a good context. Can you tell us some of the ways you get the most complete requirements from the prospect customer? And I think, I think this may be elements of discovery, perhaps, to then put that story together. Who wants to take this one?
I can chime in and then I'll
go for
pass it. It looks like Sarah and Pam as well. So one thing that I really like to do when I start getting involved in a customer call, I'll obviously review all the discovery notes, but sometimes it's a particular prospect profile or a certain market. I always use the first 10 minutes or so to ask those additional questions. So going a level deeper than the discovery that perhaps the account exec had captured initially, and then taking everything I learned from that and embedding it into the stories that I then tell throughout the demo. So any additional level of pain that I can uncover during that discovery, or building more context into a particular challenge that they're having, and then try and craft my stories around that. Sarah, I know that.
Yeah. So listening is a very underrated skill, I think, in the sales world, and open-ended questions, and then followed up with questions like, can you tell me more? Or why is a great one, because then if you can, 5 whys. I always say if you get 5 whys, you can actually get to the root of a problem if you keep asking questions time after time. But definitely trying to get the customer to open up as much as possible about something. So you use those open-ended questions to get there, and then try not to jump in and finish their thought processes. Make sure that they're actually talking. And if you hear something that is maybe a nugget from your perspective that you could use, then that's where you use could you tell me more about XYZ, or I'd love to learn a little bit more about XYZ, and get them to open up about those different channels. So being inquisitive with them and you really probing, and why is that important, or why doesn't that work right now? You know, all those why questions, and that tell me more, and then just zip it and listen.
Fantastic. Pam, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, they both have nailed this one. I mean, we could all do a better job listening during discovery, and also pulling out the, the whys, as Sarah mentioned. I mean, that's really just the most important part of all of this. And the only way to get to be able to tell better stories is understanding from the beginning what is the real challenge. And only way you're going to find that is, again, asking those questions. And there's no secret sauce there. It really requires that you're patient and you ask another question. I always say, what's the most important thing you can, what's the most important answer you can say is, hey, ask another question. So before I answer you, like, let me ask you another question. And just, as you say, you can get down to the 5 levels, and you're going to really know so much more than when you first started. And I think sometimes we're trying to get to, maybe almost lead the witness, as Sarah was mentioning. You're trying to get to something specific because maybe that's really what your solution is all about, but it's really more about understanding those challenges and asking more questions.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for that. And yeah, I love the masterclass too. Erin, if you think about how we can partner with sales, and other colleagues, right, to make sure that we each add 2 stories during that meeting. We talked a little bit about that alignment. That's so important in the real world or physical in-person meetings, but also I think to some extent even more important when we're doing these virtual meetings. I know there was a discussion around, hey, AE, you watch for these cues, right? And I'll focus on these things, and that teamwork super important. Anything that comes to mind around tips or suggestions you would give folks?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, preparation is key. So remembering to really understand the way in which your account exec approaches the conversation. So try and find that rhythm. I'm sure, every organization is organized slightly differently, but if you're working with certain reps, you'll start to understand sort of the cadence of the calls and how you and them can build in that rhythm throughout. But especially in those really long demos where maybe it's an hour or 2 or possibly even a full day, it's so important to have that change in voice, because hearing that same voice for 2 hours straight, regardless of how engaging your story is or calling out certain folks on the line, you're still going to lose some engagement here or there, especially in a virtual world where someone can be doing something on the side of their desk during that meeting. So I always like to really prepare with that account exec, either pinpoint a certain part of the conversation or the call that you want them to then chime in with a certain story. Or honestly, if you know that they've got a certain story in their back pocket, as that conversation is sort of just evolving over the call, just prompt them to, hey, so-and-so, could you talk about, this story or this experience that you've had, and let them have an opportunity to speak as well. So
Thank you. Pam, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I believe that this selling motion is a team sport, as I mentioned earlier, and I encourage the teams to work on the delivery, really work on in their prep how we're going to talk about stories. As Erin was mentioning, it's really, let's not be the pre-sales person speaks the entire time and the account exec asks, one question at the end. What are the next steps? I encourage them both to work on the stories together, because that's just going to make it more engaging. Again, like you said, in the virtual world, if you just talk for even an hour straight, who wants to do that? I try to remind people, this is really supposed to be collaborative and also conversational. We want to engage people in a conversation. And even though that means we might be showing some software or maybe we're asking more questions, it's really about engaging, and we want communication, right? We want our AEs and SCs to work together on the story. And not just, storytelling as, I had this customer and they did this, or an overall, maybe on a slide, the AE is talking about, one of our big customers did XYZ, but sometimes answering a question could be a story. Hey, that reminds me of, my customer, blah, 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 who did something very similar. And then it could be a question after that. Does, again, these stories aren't just to be told to let them, sit out there. It's really to create more conversation, right? So let's just use it as a way to be able to keep that conversation flowing during the hour or 2 hours, or how long you have that person on the phone. That way, again, it also helps with engagement, right? Again, if you got a million things going on, you're not thinking about the presentation. So I highly encourage that as well.
Yeah, no lazy AEs, right? And
No,
coming from, I've been an AE, so I can throw myself under the bus here.
sure you didn't
Uh,
do that, George. No way.
What advice would you give someone who doesn't feel like they're a natural storyteller, Pam?
Yeah, this is really great because sometimes, we're all different levels of, introvert, extrovert. And sometimes, some folks will say, oh, I just don't feel comfortable telling stories. And I challenge that because honestly, I always say, listen, everyone can be a storyteller. I believe you can learn the skill. And if you think about it, you probably tell stories to your mom or your spouse. Storytelling should be as natural as this kind of conversation that we're having here today. And it's just feeling comfortable about the story and feeling confident that you know all the points, but then also, you don't tell your spouse a story that, you don't want them to listen to. So it's in a similar way, right? So I feel like, again, it's one of those really necessary skills in life that we're all learning along the way. Not everyone is going to know all the same stories, and we're all not going to tell it the exact same way. So we just have to feel comfortable and confident in being able to, just the same way we do a demo or we do a presentation. Really, it's again about, being able to use it as a communication tool. And I think everyone can learn that. So yeah, I'm super passionate about trying to get everyone to engage and be able to, tell a story in a way that, makes them comfortable with the content that they're speaking.
Awesome. Sarah.
Wow, Pam gave such a great answer to that. I'm not sure I can add very much more because I totally agree with that. I think that everyone can be a storyteller. And I think that we forget, you look at any little kid, you just need to spend time around a playground and you can hear the stories that they're telling each other. We are all born with the ability to be able to tell stories. And I think that as we mature into the working world, we forget that because there's so many facts and figures in our heads that we forget that it's most engaging when you are telling a story about those facts and figures. So I think it's one of those skills that's a little rusty that, practice makes perfect. But I totally agree with Pam. Everyone can do it. And I don't think you should either overthink it either, because if you've put a little bit of thought into the detail that you need to be sharing, it's just then how do you structure it and how do you format that? I love the 4 elements that Pam was explaining earlier. So, just slotting it into that format and, practice makes perfect.
Fantastic. All right, we got a couple minutes here left. Let's go and transition into Q&A here. We have our first question from Rand. What skills would you recommend someone who is just getting into the job to focus on and where to start? Of course, this is Rand, I'm assuming it's an SE here. Erin, maybe kick us off there?
Yeah. Going back to becoming an active listener, I think it actually is a skill that you need to practice. So rather than just taking what they're saying at face value, like really listening to what they're saying and then building in that curiosity factor and digging into the why behind it. So to Sarah's point, like continuing to ask why or what else or what's the impact of that on your business. so that you can really get to the true pain. And then I would say communication as well, like always keeping that so what in mind in everything that you're saying. If you can't figure out what the so what is, probably what you're saying is not something that is necessary, and your time is so valuable, as is the prospect. So how can you make the most of that 30 minutes or 1 hour that you get with them?
Great. Sarah or Pam, want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think everything, Erin, I concur. It's really important to learn to be an active listener. I think overall pre-sales, this is an amazing time, I believe, to be coming into pre-sales. There's so many resources out there. I mean, the pre-sales collective is, in my mind, a godsend. I mean, years said, why don't we have anything just dedicated to us? And so kudos to James and UG and the rest of the amazing team on this call today, because this is really just a great resource, and there's all kinds of stuff available to you, that you can help you get started in pre-sales and what to focus on. And there's lots of certifications. So yeah, take advantage of what's available out there, because a lot of us who started many, many years ago, we just kind of learned it as we went, and hopefully honed some of those skills along the way. So yeah.
Sarah, question: what proportion of the meeting should be dedicated to stories? This is from Connell.
I think that, well, that's actually a little difficult to answer, because it depends on what type of a meeting it is. If it's more of a early stage sales cycle meeting where you're really trying to understand the customer a little bit more, I think a couple of customer stories are good to drop in, but you should be listening that old 80-20 rule. You should be listening 80% of the time. If you're later stage where you're actually playing information back to the customer, 80-20 again, if you're doing 80% of the talking here, 80% of that should be woven in with a storytelling delivery mechanism that you're doing with that, I think. So yeah, 80-20 and flip it depending on where you are on the sales cycle.
Thank you for that. This question's from Emilio Rodriguez. If we're not using storytelling today, any tips around how to introduce it to, I guess, Amelia's pre-sales team? Erin, any tips there?
Yeah, I think two things that come to mind. One is start building that bank of stories. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, connect with different departments, whether it's case studies through marketing, whether it's your implementation client services team, to understand customer stories and great implementations. But I also think when beginning to build those stories in, one thing that resonated with me, it's probably about 4 years ago now that I did it, but demo to win as well, that tell, show, tell concept. So think about or tell what you're going to show, and that's where you can start to set the stage with your story. Show it through your product, and then reiterate that value and circle back to that story again at the end. So that would be one way to keep it in mind. And I think those resources are online somewhere, or you can go and join one of the classes through Demo to Win. So
awesome. I know we have 2 minutes or a minute or so, and 2 last questions. So maybe we'll get through this quickly. From Matt, what are some of the ways to successfully set the stage prior to the SE sharing the screen and starting the demo? So often the AE is anxious to cover a couple slides, company background, etc. How do you essentially start the storytelling in the upfront presentation? Pam, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I actually think I would, tell, show, tell is huge. It starts with the entire presentation. Here's what we're going to tell you today. I don't believe that we should do a ton of, company slides, we raise money, all this stuff until after we've actually done the presentation. I think it needs to be focused on the customer. Always focus on the customer, the prospect. They're your audience. They don't care that much about you. So make it about them. That's number one. And I believe in using what we call it the situation slide, what we heard about you, and that's your opening tell. This is what you told us. This is why we're here today. This is how we can start telling stories. Show them, jump into what you're going to show them, weave your stories in there. And then at the end, as you're tying it back to, this is what we said we were going to tell you, that's where, if you still have time and you want to say, this is why it's important who we are, we're here to stay, we're a company that has funding, blah, blah, blah. Again, I think we need to flip it on it. We need to make it about them. It really needs to be all about them.
And Matt, make sure you do a dry run, and then you can get
Absolutely.
not to do all of that stuff up front, just like Pam said.
100%. Yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Leah was asking how they can connect with the speakers. So maybe join the pre-sales collective if you're not already, Slack community, maybe, they'll always love to continue the conversation in the community. And of course, I think LinkedIn is probably a great location. All right, well, before we wrap up, we have one last question, Sarah, from David Goldberg. With the increase in pre-recorded canned videos as initial touch points, where does storytelling come into play? And are there different elements to focus on since it's short and generic?
This is a great question, David. Thank you so much for asking. I love being able to use pre-recorded canned demos, but they are still no substitute for live interaction with your customer. I like to be able to pick and choose where in the sales cycle the pre-recorded stuff comes in. I think it's a great door opener. It's a great teaser before you actually have a live presentation. It's a great summary as well after the fact, to be able to use as a lead behind. But I never think it's a substitute for a real live interaction. And that's where I think that your storytelling comes into play. You can pick up on the elements from that canned demo, it's something along the lines of, I sent you XYZ use case today, or business process, or example of our solution in operation. Did you know that ABC company uses this for a little, so you can pick up on that, but I don't think it's a substitute. And by the way, I love mixing the media in a sales cycle. So using like the canned videos, using Zoom, but also, using whiteboarding tools like Mural or something like that, just to keep it fresh. I love what Erin was saying earlier about no one wants to hear somebody speaking for an hour or two without a break. So, and it's the same way with the way that they're being interacted with. So mixing up the media with those storytelling is another great way to keep interest and keep the momentum going.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. We're at the top of the hour, and how these meetings go. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Just a couple announcements and housekeeping here. I just real quick, I work at Reprise, and I think one of the things that I love about Reprise is really that we're category creating. I'm not going to dive into a sales pitch here, but if you are interested in learning more, please let me know. We build tools actually to build demos for pre-sales folks. But I think if I think about what I love the most about Reprise is, as I mentioned, category creating. It's a brand new space, just kind of navigating the balance between innovation and execution early in an early stage startup. The company's almost going on 2.5 years old now, and it seems like 10 years or so. So just want to give my employer a shout out for partnering with the PreSales Collective. We've been partners for a couple years now. I think from some of the early days there. So thank you so much to Reprise. And
we're a great user of you, Georgie. So it's I love your capabilities. Just an additional plug there for you. We have hundreds of assets utilizing your tools. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for that. I know Zendesk is a customer, but thank you for actually pointing that out. So thank you. Yeah, just real quick, we're going to launch a poll there. So if you do have a quick second to take a look, and just let us know how we're doing. We always want to do better. So again, thank you so much for your time. Time is so important, right? Especially these days. And just real quick, we are launching, we being the Pre-Sales Collective is launching the first ever pre-sales conference coming up next August. So definitely keep an eye out for messages or updates around when that's going to be coming. There's going to be a ton of events in 2023 that's also going to be out pretty soon. And as we heard here today, the Pre-Sales Collective is just world class and has been putting together resources and other initiatives to really support the pre-sales community, but also help folks up level and have fun, right? Because fun is important, right? And without further ado, thank you folks so much for taking the time today. And don't forget to connect with other folks that let's say submitted their LinkedIn URL in the chat. And then also don't forget to join the Slack community, as I've said a couple of times, because it's super, super important. And then also lastly, connect with the speakers. And without further ado, have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, or I should say morning for some folks. Take care, everyone.